So Dave is a professor of biology at Sussex University, specialising in bumblebee ecology and conservation. He's an accomplished author and has published several books on the subject of bumblebee conservation, as well as on insect ecology and conservation more generally. So be sure to check those out after the talk. Today is going to be talking about the insect biodiversity crisis and what can be done to tackle it. So over to you, Dave, when you're ready.
Thanks, Ben. I'm good to go. Thanks for inviting me to talk to you. I hope the connection is good. You
Brilliant, yeah.
Yeah? Cool. Okay, bear with me a second. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Okay. I need your permission to share my screen. It says host has disabled participant screen sharing. Can you enable that for me, Ben?
Okay, let's see. Who we got? I'm not sure if I'm actually host. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, I think Will has done it.
Someone says they've done it. Let me try again.
Yeah, so hopefully it should work.
It's all good. Okay. Hopefully in just a moment. There we go. I'm hoping you can see my slides now. Great. So yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. I was an undergrad at Oxford many years ago. I haven't been back recently, but anyway, I've been interested in insects all my life. Ever since the age of 5 or 6, I don't know where it came from. I kind of just went through a bug phase and never grew out of it. And I think many people do. This is my youngest son, Seth, with his pet cockchafer, Colin, who's sadly no longer with us, but the Colin that is. But Seth loves insects. He catches them, holds them in his hand, looks at them, puts them in jam jars and tries to keep them alive. And he's just completely fascinated. And I think lots of people are like that when they're young, but they usually grow out of it. And this, I think, is rather sad because the reaction of most people when they're teenagers or adults to anything that buzzes near them is to swat it, to roll up a newspaper and kill it. I think they're frightened. They think it's going to sting them, bite them, give them a disease or something. I don't really know, but it's rather sad in my view. So my kind of mission in life is to try and persuade people they should love insects, or at the very least that we should all respect insects because they're hugely important. But before I say any more about insects, I'm going to give you some rather cliched, more introductory kind of information, stuff you know already, but I think it's important to keep in mind. So this, of course, is our beautiful planet, this amazing, extraordinary thing, this rock hurtling through space with millions of species clinging to its surface. We don't know exactly how many, maybe 5 million, maybe 10 million, we're really not sure. It's extraordinary, and it's our home. It gives us everything we could need. And yet, of course, we're making a right pig's ear of it. You're all aware, I'm sure, of all of these issues. Climate change is the most recognized, and obviously we're in danger of seriously damaging our climate and possibly reaching a point where it becomes a runaway process as soon as 10 years from now, according to some estimates. But there are a whole bunch of other issues that are slightly less well known. Things like global soil erosion, which is happening at a terrific pace, pollution of rivers, seas, the air, the soils with heavy metals and pesticides and fertilizers and umpteen other chemicals. Deforestation, of course, and I could go on and on. I don't need to go through all these things. You get the idea. My real focus is on the bottom one, biodiversity loss. And of course, we're in the 6th mass extinction event, according to most scientists, species going extinct faster than they have for about 65 million years since the meteor strike that wiped out the dinosaurs. And currently, species extinction rates running at somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times the historical average, which means that we might be losing as many as 1 species an hour very, very crudely, which is pretty terrifying. When you start talking about extinction events, people tend to focus on large charismatic animals. You might be thinking about northern white rhinos or tigers or polar bears or whatever it might be. But actually, it's recently become apparent that the smaller creatures that get much less attention are also in big trouble, and that probably the majority of species going extinct are actually insects, partly because they make up the majority of life on Earth. Now, insect declines really came to the fore 3 years ago when a paper was published in Science. Sorry, no, it wasn't in Science, it was in PLOS ONE, from a German group of entomologists who'd been catching insects in Malaise traps. That's a Malaise trap, top right there. It's catches flying insects of all types, and they end up in a bottle of alcohol. And this chart shows you the daily weight of insects caught per Malaise trap from 1989 to 2016 at sites scattered all over Germany. And as you can see, they fell pretty dramatically. They fell by 76% in that 26-year period, which is an astonishing figure and quite terrifying if you think about it. And the evidence is that this is not something that's confined to Germany. We have other long-term data sets on insects mainly from Europe and North America. We don't have much from other continents. But in Europe and North America, this seems to be a general pattern, and I'll spare you showing you lots and lots of similar graphs. But we have similar data, for example, for butterflies from the UK, showing steady declines over decades. So it does seem that insects really are in trouble. And E.O. Wilson, who's a famous American biologist, I'm sure you've heard of him and come across him in your studies, he put it pretty nicely. I won't read the quote out, but he basically said that if people were to disappear, the planet would do jolly well without us. But if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And he's absolutely right. Now, I want to quickly run through why insects are important. So I've already mentioned one reason, which is that they make up the majority of species on Earth, or at least the species that we know of. We've named about 1.5 million species of animals and plants so far, of which about 1 million are insects. So roughly 2/3 of known life are insects. And then they're food for a very large number of other species. Many species of birds, bats, lots of amphibians, reptiles, freshwater fish, all feed upon insects. So if you're one of these gorgeous bee eaters living in Germany, say, then these are birds that feed particularly on flying insects. 3/4 of their food supply has disappeared since 1989, seemingly, which is clearly going to have a big impact on their populations. But insects, then, they do umpteen other things. There are so many of them and they're so diverse. They're involved in more or less every ecological process you can think of on land or in fresh water. They're more or less absent from the sea, I should say. But on land, they're everywhere, doing all sorts of things, recycling nutrients in dead bodies, cowpats, leaves, trees, keeping the soil healthy. They're vitally important biocontrol agents, and so on and so on. And most of this goes kind of unrecognized. People are very ignorant of the lives of most insect species. And I just thought it'd be fun to highlight a couple of the less well regarded insects here and point out how interesting and important they are. So here you go. Some of you might recognize this, hopefully. This is a lacewing larvae, a native UK species. These are really important predators of aphids, both as larvae and adults, in fact. And the larvae has these kind of scimitar-shaped jaws that it stabs into aphids. And they're like syringes. It sucks out the juice of the aphid as it feeds. And then it sticks the dried husk on its back. And we don't know for sure why they do that. Presumably it's maybe some sort of camouflage or disguise or whatever to avoid being predated. We don't really know, but that's what gives it this bizarre kind of wig of dried aphid husks. Then there's earwigs, which are a bit of a favourite of mine. Most people don't really like earwigs, sadly. I think they're rather cool. They used to be seen as pests. It was common for farmers, particularly with apple orchards, to spray them to kill the earwigs because they do feed a bit on the blossom. And if the fruit is bruised, they'll nibble on it. But actually, as pests, they're inconsequential. They're much more important. It's recently been discovered, again, as biocontrol agents. Earwigs are nocturnal, and they run up the tree trunk at night and spend the night feeding on aphids and other small crop pests. And in fact, a healthy earwig population in an apple orchard can eat as many aphids as a farmer could kill with 3 rounds of insecticidal sprays. So they're valuable animals to look after. Also rather cool because they're unusual insects in showing parental care. That's what this picture shows. The female earwig guards her eggs in a nest and looks after the young nymphs until they're about half grown, and then she shoos them out. And if they don't leave at that stage, she eats them. So she's not the perfect mother, but nonetheless, fascinating little creatures. Of course, the thing that insects do that's most widely recognized is they are pollinators. The thing they do for us, at least. People tend to think that bees are the main pollinators, but it's important to note that actually there are thousands of species of pollinator just in the UK, including butterflies, moths, hundreds of species of flies, wasps, beetles, and so on. A really diverse group of insects that pollinate flowers. And between them, 87% of all plant species on the planet require animal pollination. To be fair, a few of them are pollinated by hummingbirds or bats or whatever, but the very large majority are pollinated by one type of insect or another. So without pollination, most plant species would disappear. They would set no seed. And so bees are perhaps the most famous of the pollinators, and that's partly because bees are different to the other flower visiting insects in that they don't just drink nectar for their own purposes, but they also feed their offspring on pollen and nectar, which makes them different to a fly or a butterfly or whatever. It means the adult bee has to visit more flowers than it would otherwise have to do just to satisfy its own needs, which is why bees are kind of specialist flower visitors more so than other insects. And they have lots of adaptations to make them good at collecting pollen and nectar, including branched hairs, which is one of the distinguishing features of bees, which helps to trap pollen on their bodies. And you see this bee's trapped a lot of pollen, so much it can barely fly, in fact. But anyway, you can see why bees are effective pollinators, just looking at that. And so between bees and all the other insect pollinators, 3/4 of the crops we grow are pollinated by insects. And if we didn't have insect pollinators, then our supermarkets wouldn't look half as good. Everything from apples and cherries to strawberries, raspberries, chili peppers, tomatoes, pumpkins, even things like coffee and chocolate are insect pollinated. So we really need to look after these little creatures. And I mean, literally millions or perhaps billions of us would starve if we didn't have pollinators. So we have a very good selfish reason to look after them better than we have. We need to avoid ending up like this. These pictures have been shown many times, but and they look kind of attractive, really. People in their traditional costumes in southwest China, where they have large areas of pear and apple orchards. But these people are hand pollinating because they've got no insect pollinators left, or at least not enough to pollinate their crops properly. So they have to send their kids climbing high up to do the higher flowers. It's hard to imagine a UK farmer hand pollinating his field of oilseed rape. So we need to make sure this doesn't happen everywhere else. Unless we go down this route, this is one solution that's been proposed to the pollinator crisis, which is to build little robots to replace them, which is quite an intriguing idea. And I can imagine if you're a robotics engineer, it might be quite fun to try and build a little robot that can pollinate flowers like a bee. So on the left are two kind of prototype drones, bee bots, whatever you want to call them. The picture on the right, you might be puzzling over what that's all about. That's a system that's been developed in Japan, where they're trying to build drones that have little bubble blowers on them, which blast bubbles onto the crop, and the bubble mix contains pollen. So the idea is that the bubbles land on the stigma of the flower and pollinate it like that. But I think this is a slightly nuts approach. You know, when you think of the resources, the energy, the plastics, the metals that would be required to build, we would need trillions of little bee bots if we wanted to replace insects as pollinators. And when you think that we have real bees already that are they've been pollinating for the last 120 million years. They're really quite good at it. They're biodegradable, they're carbon neutral, they're self-replicating. They seem to have a whole bunch of desirable properties in a pollinator. And it seems to me it would be wiser to look after the real thing rather than build their replacements. But anyway, that's my opinion. So if we're going to look after insects better into the future, we need to understand why they're declining. And it's a big topic, and there's a lot of debate about what are the biggest drivers. There's no doubt at all that insect declines are caused by multiple factors. Probably I put them in a very crude order of importance. Habitat loss remains probably the biggest single driver of insect declines and of biodiversity declines generally on the planet. But pesticides are certainly having big impacts on insects, as are other issues like the spread of foreign diseases, which we've accidentally moved around the planet. Climate change is starting to kick in. Fertilizers probably have quite a big impact, light pollution, and so on and so on. And I haven't got time to go into all of these things. I'll just say a little bit more about the first two. So firstly, loss of habitat. From an insect's perspective, one of the most valuable habitats that we used to have in Western Europe was flower-rich grasslands. This is a lovely example of a surviving patch of flower-rich grassland, a lowland hay meadow on South Uist in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. 100 years ago, Britain had about 7 million hectares of this habitat. It was everywhere. It was on almost every farm. Every farm had a hay meadow or two. Or chalk downland, which is a similar kind of flower-rich habitat. And a habitat that supports a diversity of wildlife, including many, many species of insect. But sadly, in the 20th century, we destroyed 97% of that habitat, replacing it with stuff like this. And we shouldn't really be surprised if that resulted in a major decline in biodiversity. It's kind of obvious why. We've moved to this system of farming that relies upon, that's based upon planting large areas of monocultures, which clearly is not going to support a huge diversity of life, particularly when you spray it with lots of pesticides, which we'll come back to in a second. So this system of farming has really simplified the landscape in a way which is perhaps not obvious to most of us because it happens slowly. And I love this. Well, love is perhaps the wrong word. I think these images here really dramatically illustrate just how profoundly the European landscape has changed in the last few decades. Many people now, you look out the window of a train as you cross the countryside, people think the countryside has always looked like it currently looks or has for hundreds of years, but actually it hasn't at all. The countryside has profoundly changed. And these pictures were taken from France, but you'd have seen the same thing if you had them in the UK. Top left was an aerial photograph taken in 1958, and the others are of exactly the same place, but photographed on subsequent dates through to 2010, bottom right. And it's really dramatic, isn't it? Just how much the landscape has changed, where there used to be hundreds and hundreds of little tiny fields with a diversity of crops. Now there's just a very small number of giant fields. And this has happened throughout the developed world. In some countries more than others. This is, as you might realize, a North American scene where they have fields on a scale that dwarf anything we've managed to produce in Western Europe. And clearly the consequences for biodiversity are obvious. There isn't really much scope for biodiversity to thrive in a landscape as uniform and monotonous as this. Now, as I mentioned, pesticide use is an integral part of this approach to food production. You can't grow vast monocultures of crops very easily without applying lots of chemicals, including fertilizers and a range of pesticides. This is quite a big topic and I haven't got time to go into it. It's something my own research group at Sussex has been studying for some time, particularly with regard to the impacts on bumblebees. I'll just throw you a few figures. So in the UK, each year, farmers apply 16.9 thousand tons of pesticides to the landscape, and that's a mix of insecticides, herbicides, molluscicides, fungicides. Essentially, the farmer tries to kill pretty much anything that dares to grow anywhere or live anywhere near his crop. And that obviously has impacts on biodiversity, particularly since the majority of the countryside, 70% of Britain, is farmland. Okay, so that's all the doom and gloom over with, more or less. So insects are in trouble. What can we do about it? Let's be positive. Well, the good news is there's lots that can be done about it. Many of these conservation issues are a bit depressing because you feel rather helpless about, you see on the news images from Brazil where the rainforest is burning or the ice caps melting in the Arctic or whatever. And you feel personally pretty helpless about those things. But with insects, they live all around us. They live in our parks and gardens, our fields, and therefore we can all get involved in looking after them. And also most insects have yet to go extinct. And because they breed much more quickly than, for example, a rhinoceros, they actually can recover really quickly if we just provide them with the right conditions. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on two different areas. Firstly, on what we can do in urban landscapes to make them more insect friendly. And then I'll finish off by talking a bit more about farming and how that could possibly be done differently. So firstly, urban landscapes. I think there's a huge kind of open door to transform our urban areas into essentially nature reserves, not just for insects, but for all of our wildlife. There are 22 million gardens in the UK covering an area of about 500,000 hectares, which is a bigger area than all of the nature reserves in Britain put together. And that's without counting parks, road verges, roundabouts, cemeteries, and all the other kind of urban green spaces. Just imagine if they were all being managed in a way that made them wildlife friendly. They were all free of pesticides and full of the right kinds of flowers, wildflowers, and I'll talk more about these things in a minute. That's a kind of ready-made network of habitat for insects and other wildlife, with no real cost, no real downside to that. There's no sacrifice to be made, particularly apart from perhaps getting used to our gardens looking slightly different. So I'm pretty excited about this idea. I've written a book about it. Sorry to plug my own books, but there you go, The Garden Jungle, a bestseller apparently. Do have a look if you're interested. You'll probably get it in the library. So I'm going to run through some of the things we might do in our urban areas, in our gardens, in our college grounds in Oxford, which might include, for example, mowing less. There's an awful lot of mown grass in Oxford colleges and in gardens. We Brits are slightly obsessed with trying to recreate a kind of Wimbledon tennis in our, the perfect green uniform stripy lawn seems to be the ambition of some people. So much so that some people actually buy plastic grass and save the trouble of trying to recreate it in a more natural way. But lawns don't need to look like that at all. Lawns that are mown all the time are rather sterile. They support rather little life. But if you leave them to grow, they usually spring into flower and then start attracting lots and lots of insects. So this is my garden lawn, and I haven't done anything to it apart from I don't cut it very much. I didn't sow any wildflowers, they're just there. And they are in most lawns if you give them half a chance. So, you know, I always sort of say to people, next time they get the urge to mow, just try and chill out, make yourself a cup of coffee or a gin and tonic and sit down and just watch the flowers open and the bees arrive. Relating to that, even if you don't have your own garden, you might get involved in trying to persuade the local council to change the way they manage urban green spaces, community-owned spaces. So this picture is taken in Stirling in Scotland, where I used to work. And it shows the results of the handiwork of a little local campaign group of people who call themselves On the Verge. That's their little sign there with the sort of slightly disturbing bee on it. They spend their weekends digging over any bit of amenity grassland they can get their hands on, in this case a road verge, and sowing it with wildflower seeds. And you can see the result is really spectacular, and it's teeming with insect life. So at the last count, there are, I think, 93 patches like this in Stirling, which is a small city. So there's a road verge, there's a roundabout. Just imagine if every roundabout in Britain was covered in wildflowers like that. Wouldn't that be cool? A huge improvement, I think. I'd also love it if we could persuade people to be generally more tolerant of what are usually regarded as weeds. And this is, well, weeds are quite an interesting thing because they're essentially a figment of our imagination. They're a concept we've invented, certainly in a garden context. We've decided some plants are undesirable and others are desirable, and we spend lots of money on encouraging one group and lots of money on trying to wipe out the other. But actually the distinction is nowhere near as sharp as you might think. And many weeds are actually very good for wildlife and rather beautiful. So in fact, you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that by calling them wildflowers instead. And these three species you can see on screen in front of you, I'm sure you probably recognize at least one of them and perhaps all three of them: dandelions, ragwort, spear thistle. Fantastic, beautiful flowers, really good for insects. And yet people spend an awful lot of effort trying to eradicate them. And even ragwort is rather demonized, in fact. Anyway, that's a story for another day. We also, on a very related matter, need to stop doing this. This is nuts. This, you might work out for yourself, is the result of herbiciding in city streets, which is something that goes on all the time. Many councils employ workers on quad bikes with a big tank of herbicide on the back. It's usually glyphosate, which is a chemical has become rather notorious. There's a growing body of evidence that it's harmful to the soil, to bees, and most famously to people. There's a fair bit of evidence that it's a carcinogen, and there have been some very high profile court cases in the United States which have ruled that it is indeed the likely cause of cancer in people who've used it. And yet we spray this chemical all over the place, on our pavements, along the edges of playgrounds and in our parks and in our gardens. And why exactly? What harm was that little bit of vegetation doing? It wouldn't have supported a vast amount of wildlife, but it would have had a few insects in it, I'm sure. And now it's dead. For why? Why is that necessary? Why can't we just tolerate a bit of greenery in our towns, in the pavements and so on? Seems very bizarre to me. I would personally ban pesticides from urban areas, and some cities have already done this. Toronto banned pesticides about 15 years ago completely, and other cities internationally too. France recently banned all pesticides for urban use across the whole country. Why can't we do that? I think it's nuts that people can go wandering into their local garden centre DIY store, even supermarkets sell these things, and buy a bottle of something which is basically poison and start spraying it around their garden without any training at all. It's absolutely insane. And you just don't need them in a garden context. I've got a big garden. I grow lots of fruit and veg, lots of flowers, and I don't use any pesticides. And you just don't need them. Occasionally, I'll get some aphids on one of my vegetable plants, and I just leave them. And it's amazing how almost invariably within a few days, you get an army of predators turn up, including those lacewings I talked about earlier. You might test your insect knowledge by seeing how many of these you can identify, but I'm not going to go through them. These natural enemies will, in a nice healthy garden, will very quickly wipe out any excess of pests that you have. There's just no need to spray an insecticide. And in fact, I would argue that if you have a plant in your garden that is repeatedly attacked by insect pests, it's probably because you're trying to grow the wrong plant, a plant that's not suited to the conditions, the soil, or the temperature, or whatever it might be. Grow something else. A healthy plant can look after itself perfectly well. Speaking of plants, something that isn't widely appreciated is that not all flowers are good for pollinators. And that might seem a bit strange because, of course, all flowers evolved to attract pollinators. That's the point of a flower. It's not there to look beautiful for us. So those petals, the scents, they evolved to attract pollinators, usually insects. But we've tinkered with flowers over over hundreds of years. Humans have bred for properties that we thought were attractive. And in doing so, have often made the flowers non-functioning from an insect's perspective, or from the plant's perspective for that matter. So there's some really nice examples on screen here. It's very popular to grow what are called double varieties of flowers, the ones along the top. So that's a rose, a cherry, and a hollyhock along the top. Double varieties are mutants in which the anthers, the bits that obviously would normally produce the pollen, have mutated into extra petals. So bottom left there is a wild type rose that's really attractive to insects, lots of pollen and nectar. Above it, that is called a hybrid tea rose. It's just a bundle of petals. So you might be pleased if someone gave you one on Valentine's Day, but from a bee's perspective, that's an abomination that should be got rid of. So if we could steer people towards growing the right plants in their gardens and bearing this kind of thing in mind, that would be great. Get rid of these are all other examples of intensively bred annual bedding plants that are pretty much useless from a wildlife perspective. I don't really know what the name is there. That's a personal thing. Get rid of those and grow instead traditional cottage garden herbs. There's loads of information out there, including stacks of YouTube videos that I've made. So if you're very bored of an evening, you can follow me on a tour of my garden and find out which plants are best for insects. Things like catmint is fantastic, and lavender. And bear in mind that some varieties are much better than others, even within. So someone might say to you, lavender is good for bees, and that is a true statement. But there are hundreds of different varieties, cultivars of lavender available, and some are much better than others. We've been doing some research on this. And so, for example, this particular one, Gros Bleu, is much better, or is the best performing lavender, and 4 or 5 times better than some of the worst performing strains. Squeezing some wildflowers into urban areas would also be great. Brings me back to my theme about weeds and what is a weed. There are loads of beautiful wildflowers that you can grow in your garden, and they tend to be good for pollinators because obviously they haven't been tinkered around with by plant breeders, and also can provide larval food plant for butterfly caterpillars and so on. We also want to try and squeeze in flowering trees wherever we can in our urban areas. Flowering trees have a number of advantages over herbaceous flowers. For one, simply because a tree is a three-dimensional structure, it can support many, many more flowers than you could squeeze into say, a flower bed. But also, of course, trees capture carbon as they grow, hold the soil together, provide lots of other benefits for biodiversity and combating climate change, as well as being good for pollinators. So wherever possible, I'd love to see more flowering trees dotted around the landscape in our parks, in our streets, and so on. Should you be considering ever buying some plants to attract bees to an urban area, bear in mind that the plants on sale in garden centres are full of pesticides. So this is something we did some research on, published a paper 3 years ago. We drove around all the big name garden centres in the south of England, places like Home Base and B&Q and Wyvale and so on. And we bought the plants they were selling as bee friendly. So this is a very popular marketing strategy in garden centres. They label the plants that are attractive to bees and other pollinators with some kind of label. You can see a couple of them there. But actually, when you screen them, 75% of the plants being sold as bee friendly contain insecticides in the pollen and nectar. 70% of them contain something called neonicotinoid insecticides, which are neurotoxins which have become notorious for being particularly harmful to bees, and in fact have been banned by the European Union since 2018 for use by farmers, but we found them commonly in supposedly bee-friendly plants on sale in nurseries, which is pretty outrageous when you think about it. Hardly bee-friendly if they're full of neurotoxins. While I'm ranting slightly about pesticides, I'd just like to flag up another issue which we've been doing research on, which might seem somewhat tangential, but it isn't at all. So many people don't use pesticides in their garden. They're very aware of encouraging wildlife. They might, if they're really clued up, know that they shouldn't buy plants from their local garden centre too. But at the same time, lots of animal lovers have dogs and cats that they treat prophylactically, following the advice of their vet, against fleas. The commonest thing to do is you drip a product on the neck of your dog or cat once a month. And in fact, this is the best-selling brand of flea treatment, Advocate, is also one of these neonicotinoid insecticides. The active ingredient, you might just be able to read, depending on how big your screen is imidacloprid. It says on the front of this label in tiny font. That's a neonicotinoid insecticide, and the dose you're supposed to drip on your dog for a medium-sized dog once a month is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. That's about 4 big lorries full of dead bees every month going onto your dog. And you might think, well, yeah, I'm putting it on my dog and bees don't visit my dog. But these are long-lived persistent chemicals that are water soluble. So if your dog goes out in the rain, that chemical is going to wash off into the garden or wherever you are. If your dog, worse still, if your dog goes for a swim in the local river or canal or lake, then that's a huge amount of insecticide that will readily wash off. And we're just about to publish a paper actually showing that there are detectable residues of these insecticides in 98% of British rivers as a result of these flea treatments, which is really something to be concerned about. Anyway, I'm nearly finished rambling about gardens. Probably none of you are into gardening, and you might be wondering why I'm talking so much about gardens. But hey ho. A couple of other things you might do to make your garden more insect friendly. Make a bee hotel. That's a really ugly one I made by drilling some holes in a post, but they work really well. And within 20 minutes of starting drilling, I had red mason bees coming to investigate. That's a red mason bee top right. They come out early in the spring, and later in the summer you get leafcutter bees move into these bee hotels if there's any space left behind by the mason bees. You don't need an ugly thing like that. You can make all sorts of nice little bee hotels out of bamboo or drilling holes in nice neat blocks of wood or whatever you like. Roughly 8mm diameter hole and and off you go. They usually work really well. If you've got no DIY skills, you can buy bee hotels. There are all sorts of designs available. And some of them are rather cool and have a little window on the side, which enables you to peek in. So I should have said bee hotels are targeting a number of species of solitary bee. So a female has her own nest. There's no workers, there's no queen, as in honeybees or bumblebees. And here you can see the offspring of the bee this on the right-hand side shows you the view behind the kind of window. And the yellow stuff is pollen, and you can see the developing grubs and the little clay walls that those red mason bees make between each of their offspring. One final thing you might do in your garden is make a hoverfly lagoon. This is something that we've pioneered. It's much less well known than the bee hotel, but these work really well. These are aimed at providing breeding habitat for certain species of hoverfly that have aquatic larvae that like to live in small puddles full of rotting organic matter. And they're really easy to recreate. Any kind of waterproof container, fill it with water, chuck in some old leaves or lawn clippings, and in no time at all, as the organic matter starts to decay, it attracts these rather beautiful hoverflies to lay eggs, which hatch into rat-tailed maggots, which are rather splendid creatures, top center there. It's not a great name, it doesn't do them any favors, rat-tailed maggot. The tail is actually a breathing tube, like a snorkel, that the maggot sends up to the surface. So the maggot itself would be a tasty snack for a bird. So it lives deep beneath the surface of the water where birds can't see it, but it uses its snorkel tail to breathe. Anyway, rather cool. Make yourself a hoverfly lagoon if you've got access to any space where you could put one. Okay, so that's enough of me rambling about gardens. Just to finish off, I wanted to spend maybe 5 minutes or so talking about farming. So we could only go so far. I mean, I do think it would be amazing if we could make most gardens wildlife friendly and get councils on board with managing urban green spaces in a wildlife friendly way. But as I mentioned earlier, 70% of Britain is farmland. And that has become, over the last 100 years, increasingly hostile to life. As we've moved down this intensive monoculture farming route. And yet most of us just accept that as inevitable, as the only way we can feed the growing human population. There's going to be 10 billion of us before long or thereabouts. And most of us, I think, just accept without really questioning the need for this kind of farming, because we obviously do have to grow a lot of food to feed everybody. But is this really the only way we can feed everybody? Well, I actually would argue that if we carry on down this route, people will starve in the future in their millions, because this is not sustainable in the long term. This type of farming contributes about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions when you combine it with food transport and packaging and so on. It is doing huge damage to soils around the world. And it's the main driver of the biodiversity crisis. And if we lose biodiversity, if we lose pollinators, then we won't be able to grow crops. If we lose soil, we won't be able to grow crops. So we really need to find a way of farming that's actually sustainable. Of course, by definition, we can't grow food in a way that we can't carry on doing into the future. It's completely nuts. So what are the opportunities to change things? Well, actually, I would say we need to really redesign the farming system. I think it's kind of broken. It's failing in so many ways. And let me just explain a few of those. So right now, we grow about 3 times as many calories in the world as we need to feed the human population. Nobody is starving because there isn't enough food. They starve because they're too poor to buy it. So we're overproducing very significantly, 3 times as many calories as we need. But roughly 1/3 of that food goes to waste. I'm sure you've come across that figure before. It's extraordinary, isn't it? We do all this intensive farming with huge impacts on the environment, and then we just waste 1/3 of its produce. It's insane. And we feed roughly 1/3 of the calories of crops that are grown to animals, which is also, of course, as you know, a very inefficient way of feeding people, particularly indoor kept animals fed on grain and beans that are grown in the field. Very crudely, it takes 30 times the area of land to support one human being who's eating beef, as if that person were eating the crop direct. I'm not actually vegetarian myself, but I think we should all try to minimize the amount of meat we eat, particularly red meat. It's simply impossible for the planet to support us all if we all consume lots of meat. So if we could significantly cut down on meat consumption and significantly reduce food waste, then we could do much less intensive farming. We could free up vast areas of land for rewilding projects or nature conservation or whatever else we wanted to do with that land, which I think is really exciting. Also, another inefficiency in the current system is that we eat simply too much. I'm sorry about this next picture, brace yourself, but a current feature globally of what's happening is that people have poor diets and they overconsume. They eat a lot of grain, and so the bulk of the world's agriculture is devoted to huge fields producing grain and oil seeds, which largely go to produce either animal fodder or foods that are not particularly healthy for humans, things, heavily processed foods, pizzas, pastas, pies, pastry, cakes, biscuits, stuff that makes us unwell, that makes us fat. And that costs the economy enormously. There's a recent estimate from the UK that obesity in the UK is costing the UK economy £27 billion a year. That's serious money. And it's simply being produced by poor diet, overeating the wrong kind of food. So that's something else we really need to take seriously, because it's doing, you know, what's the point in growing huge amounts of food so that we can overconsume it and make ourselves ill? It doesn't make any sense at all. And at the same time, while we produce so much, overproduce grains and oils, there are not enough fruits and vegetables in the world to feed everybody on the planet a healthy diet. So we need to change what we grow and the way we grow it, I would argue. So how might we grow food in a more sustainable way? Well, so we've been doing some research on allotments, and I find allotments quite fascinating. So we've been quantifying the yields allotmenters get from their allotments. And a good allotmenter, an experienced allotmenter who's been doing it for a few years, if he's keen, can get the equivalent of 35 tons of produce per hectare from his land. That's mixed fruit and veg, often pesticide-free, packaging-free, 0 food miles. And if you compare that to a wheat farmer with all the chemicals, the fertilizers, pesticides, mechanization, he gets about 8 tons per hectare. So actually, this kind of farming is surprisingly efficient. And there was also a recent study published from Bristol University where they looked across the UK at insect diversity in urban areas and found that allotments supported the highest insect diversity of any urban habitat, higher even than urban nature reserves. So the thing that's really interesting here for me is that you can have food production and biodiversity in the same place. They don't need to be mutually exclusive in the way that they are in traditional intensive farming. What's more, actually, allotment soils have much more carbon trapped in them than average agricultural fields. And there was a really interesting study from the Netherlands a couple of years ago, which showed that allotmenters, on average, are healthier than people. They compared them with their immediate neighbors who didn't have allotments. So allotments can produce lots of healthy food, look after biodiversity, capture carbon in the soil, and make people healthy. That seems like there's wins everywhere. So why don't we encourage more of this? Why do we live in a country where there are 90,000 people on waiting lists for allotments? It seems like a really simple thing government could do would be to free up land for that and encourage more people to take up allotmenting. Of course, that isn't going to feed everybody in the world. Some people just don't have the time to have an allotment, but there are ways of farming that operate on similar principles to this with a high crop diversity. So I'm thinking of things like agroforestry, permaculture. I've got to throw in biodynamic farming here too. I don't know whether you've come across it. It does have a bit of kind of witchcraft mixed into it, but basically all of these types of farming operate on similar, very sensible ecological principles. They aim to be sustainable long-term. They aim to look after the soil and soil carbon and support biodiversity, work with nature rather than against it, to use a slightly cheesy term, but to encourage pollinators and to encourage natural enemies of the crop. They aim to be carbon neutral or even carbon negative. Most of these systems of farming use no pesticides. And ultimately, they offer the prospect of producing a diverse, healthy diet for people, much better than one based on the products of industrial farming. And I would broadly love to see more of this kind of farming going on. I think this is where we should be moving. Anyway, whatever we do, we need to do better. It's a terrible cliche to say it, but there literally is no planet B. We have nowhere else to go. Whatever Elon Musk says, we're not plausibly all going to be moving to live on Mars anytime soon. So we need to look after our planet a lot better than we have done. I find it really weird that most people would do anything for their children apart from apparently leave them a decent planet to live on. So let's try and do better, and maybe we can start by looking after the creatures that live all around us in our gardens, the insects. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you very much. It's a brilliant talk. Okay, I think we have lots of questions in the chat.
Do you want me to read them?
If you could look at the chat.
Okay. I've got
I think, yeah, if you just questions, I guess. Yeah, there's one from Nick. I think that's the first one.
Okay.
Yeah, why does, yeah.
Well, so, okay, the first one is an interesting question. I don't have a good answer to it. Why do some species do so much better than others? I mean, it's a universal pattern that any group of organisms, be it butterflies or bees or birds or whatever, contains winners and losers. There seem to be a small number of species that are adaptable, that seem to have coped reasonably well with what we've thrown at them, with the way the world has changed, and a much larger number of species that cope much less well and disappear or decline and become very rare. And I think often we simply don't really know. It tends to be associated with the degree of specialization, that species that have a highly specialized diet, for example, are less likely to thrive compared to polyphagous species that can eat almost anything. But sometimes the answers just aren't obvious, and other times they can change as well. So, for example, house sparrows seem to be a species that you would generally say is highly adaptable and has done well as a result of urbanization of the world. But then actually in recent decades, the UK house sparrow population has crashed by more than 90%, and nobody has a clue why, as far as I understand it. So yeah, it's a very long way of saying we don't really know, I don't think. Okay. Before I forget my question, does England have a problem with planting majority non-native plants versus native plants? Well, are we talking about gardens here? I'm not entirely sure. We do obviously plant a lot of non-natives in our gardens, and one downside of that is that some of them have become invasive weeds. Not many, but there are some significant invasive weeds, things like rhododendrons, Japanese knotweed, giant hogweed, which were imported as ornamental plants in the first place, Himalayan balsams, another classic. Most non-natives have done no significant harm as far as I'm aware, but there is always a risk if you bring in anything. As general rule, there is evidence that if you want to maximize biodiversity in an area, then planting native species has advantages. As I touched on in my talk, native plants are likely to be well adapted to local pollinators and to herbivores. So for example, if you want butterflies to breed in a garden, you need to plant the native plants that provide their food plant. Just to give you an example, orange-tipped butterflies will happily breed in gardens as long as you grow some lady's smock, which is their larval food plant. So we definitely ought to encourage people to plant more natives, I think. Okay, this might be a follow-up comment. Recognize the audience of North Americans. Many of the plant suggestions shown are not appropriate. Sorry, I'm not appropriate for planting on this side of the pond as they do not host our Lepidoptera. Okay, so is that someone who's not from the UK, I guess? So
Presumably, yeah.
Obviously, the wildflowers I was showing are UK wildflowers. I had assumed I was talking to a UK audience. If you're based elsewhere in the world, clearly you have a different suite of native plants. So bear that in mind when thinking what to grow. If you're a North American, then do favour North American. There's lots of beautiful North American plants you could grow instead. Okay. Goodness, bee hotels are spreading disease since they need to be cleaned and made. Yeah, I don't 100% agree. I mean, I avoid giant bee homes. I've seen some people who've created vast complexes of thousands of holes in a piece of wood, which is a rather unnatural concentration. But there's no evidence that modest-sized bee hotels increase disease incidence in bees at all. And in nature, it must be said that solitary bees very often choose to nest colonially in at high densities, which doesn't seem to do them any harm at all. So I'm not convinced. There's certainly no clear scientific evidence that bee hotels are a major problem as far as diseases are concerned. Someone says they want to ask a question out loud. I'd go for it.
I think Nell has a question, yeah.
Hiya. Sorry, it just saves me typing out. But so like with regard to what plants you advise for planting for bees, so like if I was encouraging uni to plant some in my college, what would you recommend if like a lot of them have pesticides, and would you recommend growing from seed, or is there like specific way you think you should get them from? And
yeah, so to avoid plants that have been pre-treated with pesticides, grow from seed is absolutely fine. That works. There are some organic nurseries, not many, but there's a really nice one called Rosy Bee. You can Google them. They're based in Oxfordshire, actually, just south of Oxford. And they specialize in bee-friendly plants, completely free from pesticides. They don't use peat in the compost, which is another issue, which I haven't touched on today. So basically environmentally friendly, and they do mail order. So they would be my top tip. Cheap to grow from seed. Or another alternative is to plant swap with, other, perhaps not so easy in a college context, but in a gardening context, if you look at what's growing in your neighbour's garden, most gardeners are happy to share bits and pieces that, and of course, if it's growing in your neighbour's garden well, it'll probably grow in your garden well. So that's a really nice environmentally friendly way to get hold of plants. But yeah, do beware of the expensive stuff in garden centres. Not only is it been covered in pesticides, but it's also it's probably been imported from outside the UK. It's almost certainly sold in a disposable plastic pot, and it's probably been grown in peat, all of which is bad. So there's quite an environmental footprint associated with going to the garden centre, unfortunately.
Right. What plants was it again that you recommend, or like any recommendations for?
So honestly, I don't want to plug my YouTube site, but that's the easiest answer.
Okay.
I give lots of advice on my YouTube site about the best plants for bees. Or if you can be bothered to wait, I've got a new book called Gardening for Bumblebees in April next year, which is basically very detailed about exactly which varieties are best. But it's not yet available, sadly.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Got another one from Councillor, I think.
Hi.
Organic farming. Hi. Oh, sorry, go on.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. So I'm from the US. Good evening to you all. And I'm from a city outside of Boston called Somerville, Massachusetts. And our city is, I'm very interested in what you had to talk about the urban environment, because our city is the most densely populated in New England, third in the country. We're 4 square miles. And as an elected official, so I'm the politician, how do you convince your colleagues in government in Britain? What kind of tools do you use to develop policies which reflect the academic work, the research work? So I've been here in Somerville, I've been the elected official who has pushed the most progressive policies in terms of sustainability. I'm trying to get a native species ordinance through. It's been taking me 2 years, but any tools or any thoughts that you would have that we can connect the two worlds and educate?
I wish I had a brilliant answer for you at this point. I mean, it is the major challenge for anyone who cares about the environment is how do we engage with the majority of the population that aren't really interested or aware of environmental issues. And that includes most politicians at senior level, sadly. And in fact, you've already done the thing that I normally suggest to people, which is actually get involved in local politics yourself. If you really care, the best way, I mean, you can write to your local politician, but actually become your local politician is the best thing of all, which you've already done. So I obviously top marks to you on that. It is really frustrating. You know, we live in a world where science and evidence is increasingly ignored, or it certainly has been by many politicians.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't stand for that. We have to somehow get our voices heard and try and demand that they, you know, respond to the evidence. And otherwise, you know, we're in big trouble. But I don't have a magic bullet. I so wish I did, but it's a constant frustration to me. I'm always trying to get politicians to listen, and I'm usually frustrated, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions from anybody in the pool?
There's one about organic farming. I could quickly...
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Organic farming and the Soil Association standards. So I do try and buy organic food myself wherever I can. I think pesticides are a significant problem. Organic farming is a step in the right direction, I think, but I am concerned that many organic farms look like conventional farms. They're still growing large monocultures of crops. And if you do that, you're never going to have high biodiversity. I think we need to really not just remove chemicals, but carry on with otherwise what appears to be conventional farming, but actually really fundamentally change the crops that we're growing and the way that we're growing them more along the lines that I talked about at the end. So going organic alone, I think it could be part of the solution, but is not a kind of panacea that's going to solve all of our problems, I would say.
Okay, any other questions?
Looks like it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dave. That was a brilliant talk.
Pleasure.
One more. Ooh,
GM.
GM.
That's an old chestnut.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. So I think fundamentally, anything necessarily wrong with GM, people usually assume, because I say we should avoid using pesticides, that I'm anti-GM. I think in the right hands, GM could offer huge potential, but that at present, it is in the wrong hands. You know, the likes of Monsanto are doing it to make money, and most GM crops that are currently widely used in other parts of the world outside Europe are associated with increased pesticide use rather than the decreased use that you might expect. So the classic is that the majority of GM crops in use in the world are herbicide resistant varieties. They've been engineered so that, for example, Monsanto sell the farmer his glyphosate resistant crop along with a lot of glyphosate to spray on the crop, and Monsanto make both, and they do very well out of that. But it means that the farmer doesn't need to worry about spilling herbicide on his crop because it's completely immune, and he can spray as much as he likes. That is not, in my view, a sustainable approach. But if some benign organization were to take GM technology and try to produce crops that could be grown in a truly sustainable way without, for example, pesticides, or that were more drought tolerant or salt tolerant or whatever, that could be really valuable. So I think we should keep an open mind about GM, but also be deeply suspicious of the motives of most of the companies that are producing them.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you so much for a brilliant talk. And just quickly before we go, just wanted to plug our hoodies. So we've got Biosoc hoodies if anybody's interested. Okay.
Cool. Nice to meet you all. I shall
Brilliant.
sign up.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
That's a brilliant talk. Okay, thank you.